Hello and welcome to the Smart Divorce podcast. I'm really delighted to be joined today by Kate Daly from Amicable. I came across Amicable a long time ago when I assume when they were first setting up, because it was something that was really important to me. As you'll know, if you've been listening to the podcast, Smart Divorce focuses on helping couples to divorce amicably. So the very fact that somebody went away and set up a company with that very name just got all my joy, and I went to have a look at what they did. So we're going to find much more out about it today. So to introduce Kate properly, after her own train wreck divorce, which sounds dreadful, where she spent more than £80,000 in legal fees, Kate realised there had to be a better way. And she teamed up with her friend, who is a tech entrepreneur, Pip Wilson, to set up Amicable. Amicable's purpose is to guide couples through the divorce process without acrimony and to reach productive agreements that benefit the whole family. Along with divorce coaches, Amicable has helped thousands of couples untie the knot amicably, which is absolutely amazing. Kate, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you very much for that lovely intro, Tamsin.
That is my pleasure. So tell us a bit more about how Amicable came to be. How did you set it up?
Well, as you said in the intro, my divorce was, the absolute antithesis of an amicable one. And we spent a lot of money, a lot of time arguing, and to the detriment of our children and our family. And I think that whole experience was so shocking and so awful that I came out of that feeling very bruised, and started to think about and reflect on, what had gone wrong, how we'd ended up down that path. And obviously, you have to take responsibility yourself, personal responsibility. But I also started to think about the process itself and how the process had antagonized the situation and fueled it and made it a lot worse. And I thought, okay, well, if that process is working against you from the start, then it's not surprising that when you're both in that emotional state anyway, things can go quite as badly wrong as they did for us. And I started to think about whether or not we could have done things differently and whether or not there would have been a different solution for us. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that there wasn't really anything out there. And I know there's mediation, but when you get to the end of a mediation, you still have to go away to solicitors to have your documents drafted or to have your document or your agreement reviewed. And that again seemed to be a flashpoint. And, I could imagine that we'd have worked hard in mediation, then only to be, have something whispered in each of our ears saying, oh, you don't want to settle for that, or, oh, no, you should be doing this, which is kind of what had been going on throughout our experience. And so I started to really think about how I could help people do it differently. And that was really what started me on quite a long road of discovering what a good process would look like and how it would need to be set up. And I tried at first to do it within the legal system, but that wasn't going to happen. So we had to set up it's outside of that and do something completely different. But it wasn't just, I didn't just come up with the idea of Amicable overnight. There was quite a long bit between reflecting on my own divorce and creating Amicable that was quite, where we did try, as I say, to work with lawyers and to do it from within the system, but we just couldn't get people, lawyers particularly, to come around to our way of thinking.
Yes, it's certainly a tricky business. Your background isn't in the law either, is it?
No, my background's in counselling psychology. So when I was getting divorced and my sort of professional background to that point had been working with people going through relationship breakdown. And I developed some expertise in helping people navigate the emotional side of relationship breakdown and then restarting their lives and trying to not make, similar pick badly and make similar mistakes kind of thing. So I'd been working with individuals and couples at the end of their relationships for some time. And during that time, and this was part of that evolution of setting up Amicable, during that time, I was approached by a group of solicitors who wanted some help helping their clients navigate divorce and separation by using a therapist. to get them in a better place to be able to then go on and do their negotiations. So I went from just working in private practice to working with a group of lawyers. And then I trained in what's called collaborative law. So I became what's called a family consultant, where essentially you are working with a team of professionals to help couples separate in a more amicable and collaborative way. And it's a really, truly wonderful system, but it is cost prohibitive to probably 95, if not more, % of the population, because you have got so many professionals in one room doing their best to help you do things amicably. But the sheer cost of that is, as I say, it just struck me as it was a great idea, but it just didn't reach enough people. And what's the point of having a great idea that only helps, the richest kind of few %? So
it seems to work really well in the US. They seem to be able to, I don't know how, they seem to be being able to get it to reach more people. And I suppose, I don't know if it's more expensive than going the full way, all the way through the courts, but I think it certainly seems expensive in the first place, doesn't it?
I think it does. And I think in the US, they have a different system anyway, where there are fewer alternatives to going a legal route. It's far more litigious. The expectations about how much you pay in legal fees are completely different in the US to what they are here. We don't routinely go to lawyers or use lawyers in the way that the US market is structured.
Thankfully.
Yes. So I think that's probably got something to do with it. And I think, it was just that desire to have a solution that worked for everybody, rather than just, a few well-off or middle-class people, that was really sort of driving what we wanted to do. And that's when the tech part came in. And that's why I knew very early on, there's no way I could do this on my own, and there's no way I'll be able to scale it to reach enough people, which was absolutely my desire. Because if you can't help lots of people, then it just doesn't feel right to me. And that was what I wanted to do. I didn't want to make this to be a solution that was based on cost or your income. I wanted it to be a solution that worked if you had the desire to be amicable.
No, I think that's really great. So can you talk us through how the process works with Amicable?
Yeah, so the fundamental difference is that you're working with one, what we call divorce coach, rather than having two separate lawyers working with you. And a divorce coach could come from a background like mine. I'm a divorce coach, so family consultant background, or they are people who've been mediators, or people who have been trained lawyers but just don't want to go that way anymore. And if you are a lawyer, you're not allowed to work with a couple. It's against the law. So people give up their practice certificate to come and work with couples and work in our model. So you work with a divorce coach, and at the outset, the divorce coach will help you both to set goals. And the reason for setting goals is that it helps you focus on the future, what you're trying to create, where you want to go. And it takes you out from dwelling on the past and apportioning blame and getting stuck in the, well, I deserve more because you left me and I didn't choose this, which might feel, might be exactly how you feel personally, but that's not how the law works, and it's not how financial settlements are made. So focusing on the future helps people focus on the needs, and particularly the needs of the children, if there are children. So we set goals, and we get people to paint a really vivid a picture as possible of where they want to end up, because it's really important that you hear that from each other, even if it's different, and also that your coach hears it as well, because when we come down to making some of those really nitty-gritty decisions, sometimes it's the goals that actually help us make those decisions, rather than just looking at a legal model of what might be fair or otherwise. So we set the goals, and then, just like in any other process, we have to have a full financial disclosure. So just like you would in mediation, or if you went to a solicitor, but we don't use, those awful Form E's that take 45 pages and you have to copy your bank statements since you were about 15 or whatever. We don't, we don't do that, but we do a big, proper full financial disclosure. We have a lovely system. We have a divorce portal that you go onto that asks you some very simple questions, that's very intuitive, that allows you to input your information at your own pace, so you don't get all overwhelmed It only shows you the questions that are relevant to you depending on how you've answered and that kind of stuff. So it's not like wading through a really horrible, frightening form. We've tried to make it as simple to use and as non-threatening as possible. So we take your full financial disclosure, and then we basically say, well, look, if these are the goals that we've set and these are the resources we've got to play with, how can we best split these resources to meet these goals? And that will generate a number of options. And obviously there's never just one option. So we might map out and model a few options that will help us decide which is the right option that you as a couple want to focus on. And then we'll work with that option to stress test it. You know, does it work? Does it cover our housing needs? Does it make sure we've got enough money to live on? Does it make sure we've got income in retirement? So we'll stress test those options, and then we'll create a settlement out of those stress tests that works for everybody in the family, and that doesn't just seek to make one person win and the other person lose.
That sounds pretty sensible. Pretty much the same or a similar thing to the way that we hope to help couples and individuals as well. So yeah, that's it. That makes complete sense. And then from there, once they've reached a settlement, I think I'm right in saying that you don't have to anymore send them back to lawyers, do you? Didn't you reach some landmark? I'm sure I read some huge Twitter headlines not so very long ago. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so now the next bit of the process is we will then draft all of the legal paperwork. But we did go to the High Court over that. Well, we went to the High Court over 2 points, really. The model was challenged, one, on whether we were allowed to work with couples in the way that we were, and two, whether we had the right to be able to write those legal documents. And we won, as you say, on both counts. So yay! it would have been a really hard judgment to say that nobody is allowed to work with couples. And that there would always be a conflict of interest. It just doesn't seem, it doesn't seem fair or right that would have been a judgment. So yes, I mean, the judgment applies specifically to amicable. So it's not saying that lawyers can work with couples. So it still does mean that in order to work in this way, you have to choose a non-lawyer based system. But it also said that there was nothing to prevent us from drafting a consent order as well. And we draft and we write what we call neutrally drafted consent orders, so they don't favour one person or another, because that's another of the issues with mediation. If you go to mediation, you then have to take the consent order to be drafted by one solicitor.
Yeah.
And then whoever is effectively that solicitor's client is then that your solicitor has to do what's in your best interest. That's their job. It's not a choice they can decide not to do. They have to do it in that way. So we try and provide a neutral drafting service. And that also means that people who have used a different process to come to an agreement, whether they've done it themselves, around the kitchen table, so to speak, or whether they've been to a mediator and have got an agreement they're happy with, we also offer a drafting service, a neutral drafting service, so that we can turn memorandums of understanding into consent orders for people as well, so that you can maintain that amicable couples approach that you might have done, for example, in mediation.
Oh, that's fantastic. I didn't realise you could do that. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
I think there will be other services that are being used at the minute who that would be useful for. Excellent. So we are hoping very much that no fault divorce will come into play, hopefully in the autumn, although it seems to have gone very quiet at the moment. But what difference, if any, do you think that will make?
Well, I think it will make a huge difference, and I'm really delighted that no fault divorce is eventually being made the law, because it's been a long time coming. I think the difference it makes is if you're starting a process and one of the first things you have to do is write a behaviour statement against your partner, that just sets completely the wrong tone. And we always say it's what happens in those first few days, weeks, months that sets the tone for the whole divorce. If that's sort of there in the background, hanging over somebody's head, it's just not a productive way to start. It serves no purpose. It's not looked at again. It's just something that upsets and provokes anxiety. And even though, now we're obviously having to work around that current system, and we do explain to people that it makes no difference, no one's going to see it again, it's not a matter of public record and all of those sorts of things, it just makes it harder, and it stokes conflict where there is no need for conflict to be stoked. It's a far more self-deterministic, it's a far more grown-up way of doing things, not to apportion blame, to accept that for either one or both of you, the relationship is no longer viable. And if it's no longer viable for one, effectively the marriage is over. And that's what I think the no fault seeks to recognize as well. That, it's one out, all out, and it doesn't need to be a horrible process. It's terribly difficult to come to that decision for anybody. And it doesn't therefore need to be, you don't therefore need to be punished, and it doesn't need to be made harder for you when you've already had to struggle to get to that point of either yourself or together deciding that the marriage has to end. So I'm really delighted. I think it will make a big difference. It starts people off on the right foot. And the other part of it, obviously, is that for the first time, you'll be able to divorce as a couple. And so from our perspective, being a couple service, it's great because it just means that people can do what they come to us for all the way through the process. So rather than one person having to be the petitioner and one person having to be the respondent, so one person instigating, you can do a divorce together, which means that you can, agree that you're doing it together and you're doing it as a couple. So from our perspective, it feels like the world is finally catching up.
I'm totally with you. I think that it starts off with, it's like you were saying earlier about it being about this financial settlement being fair on both sides, and you're not, throughout that process, it makes no difference who's the petitioner. It doesn't make any difference who is the wrongdoer in the filing. So if it's not going to be taken into consideration at any point, why start off on that point of you did this, you did this, you did, just doesn't make any sense in this day and age, and it's utterly bonkers that it's taken us so long to get to this point, but hey ho, they get there eventually. So yeah, absolutely agree that it is really good news from a lot of perspectives. It's interesting what you were saying earlier on about you're coming at it from a point of being a counsellor, and dealing with the emotional side of things and setting the goals kind of up front is one of the things that we say to our clients, is that you need to get the emotional stability and the emotional side of things sorted before you race off to see a lawyer or a mediator or anybody else, really, because you can't make great decisions until that happens. Is that your point of view as well?
Ideally, yes, but sometimes you don't have a choice about the timing of things. Sure. So yeah, so in an ideal situation, you would both take some time to process the end of the relationship, to do it well, to say what you need to say, to recover emotionally, and to get to that stable place where you can then make some rational, sound decisions about how you're going to split your finances. So I think everybody would say that would be the better way of doing things. And if you can do it that way, then that's great. There is always a difference between the person who starts the divorce and who's asked for it, initiates it, and the person who's hearing the news for the first time. They're always going to be in quite different starting points. If you're the instigator, you could have been thinking about this for years or months. And therefore you're in a totally different emotional space to somebody who's hearing it for the first time. And despite the fact you might think it's obvious the relationship has been in a bad place for a long time, they might not see it in that way, and this could be a real shock for them. So always recognizing that your partner is potentially in a very different emotional place to you and won't be seeing things in the same way is really important. So there's always kind of that to play, some attention to.
Mm.
But even if you are able to recognize that and to give your partner some time and then to start the negotiations, that's always the better way. But sometimes, for whatever reason, that's not people's experience, and they're being forced to do something against their timing. And in that case, then I think using a service where there is a good recognition of the emotional journey and you can access that additional support you need to be able to take you on the journey with somebody by your side. I think that's really important. And that, that again might be something like our service, or it might be having a divorce coach or seeing a therapist or something like that whilst you're going through this. So I think you can make up for the fact that the timing might not be ideal. And if you can make the timing more ideal by recognizing that one of you or both of you might need a bit of time before you then start looking at the sharp end of things, I think that's good.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. Is your service suitable for everybody?
No, I don't think any service is suitable for everybody. I think we always say that an aspiration to be amicable is a good enough starting point. So sometimes people say, well, we're not amicable, but we both want to be. And then I think, well, that's fair enough. We can work with aspiration. But there might be some people for whom our service is not suitable if there are safeguarding issues, if there's domestic violence, coercive control, anything like that. If you're dealing with alcoholism, drug abuse, any of those sorts of things that make one or both of you unstable, that then means that because you don't have the protection of the court, you are having to bring your whole self to the table. If it's not safe for you to do that, then I don't think this is the right service.
Yeah.
And I think in those cases, the court system and the legal system play a really vital role in helping people with really challenging circumstances navigate a fair and safe separation. And I think that's absolutely key. I think all of this is really about giving people choice and helping people appreciate that there are different ways of doing things. And we always say our sort of biggest thing at the moment is to try and get the message out there that if somebody mentions the D word or you're going down that road, the first thing you don't do is rush off to a solicitor, but you stop and you think and you start to have a different approach to it, rather than thinking the answer is to run to a solicitor at the first sort of shout of trouble. And I think that's the important thing, to give people some information, somewhere where they can go and look at the different options and work out what's right for them and their family, because everybody's different.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I totally agree with that. Can you have an amicable divorce if only one of you is wanting it?
Well, that's a tough one. To use our service, you've both got to be prepared to come into it. So in that sense, if you mean amicable in the brand Amicable, then no, it's a couples service. We only work with couples, so you've both got to want to do it. But if you mean more generally, with Amicable, well, we use a small a as well. So amicable in the not the amicable company sense, then I think you can make a more peaceful approach for yourself, even in the face of your ex. But the important thing is to unhook yourself from reacting to your ex. So if you want to have a more amicable divorce, then I think the key is to recognize that unless and until you start responding rather than reacting, and unless and until you separate as much as you can from your partner, that's going to be really difficult. But if you are micromanaging every decision, and if you're still worrying about what your ex does with your child on the weekends you don't have them and that kind of stuff, then I think it's really difficult to be amicable. But if you can stand back and you can think carefully about how you respond and start to get on that more business-like footing that I know in some of your other podcasts you talk about as well, and other the guests have said, but it is really about trying to professionalize your relationship and acknowledge that you're moving from being intimate, close partners where you use shorthand, you use emotion, all of those sorts of things, to actually removing that element of your relationship and putting it on a more professional, slightly less cute and cozy kind of, or informal way of talking to each other, and of signing off emails, and of making certain demands that would be perfectly acceptable within the auspices of a marriage or a relationship, but when you become co-parents, stop being so acceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that you've talked about communication and about the vital importance of communication, and changing that from that cozy relationship based to a more professional sort of standpoint. I'm sure I read or heard you saying about when you're writing a letter or typing an email, think of whether you would say that to your friend or your mum before you send it. I think that's really good advice.
Yeah, I mean, you'd be surprised how many times, I mean, we obviously, in the work that we do, we get sometimes copied into email exchanges between people. And I do read some of them and think, wow, okay, I can totally see where you're coming from. I can see why you're angry with what's been written to you, but really you would not send that to your worst enemy, let alone, somebody you're trying to, have a constructive move on relationship with. And I think that's the thing. I think it's just remembering some of the basics, like dear somebody, or thanks for your email, not just going straight in with you've done this, or you said the other week that. I mean, just very small, really small techniques like that are important. Always just pausing before you send anything, walking away. It takes the brain a good 20 minutes to calm down once it's been triggered in that fight flight response. So you really need to walk away for a good 20 minutes before your brain is anywhere near able to look at and process your potential response in any form of, reasonable way. So just making sure you don't fire stuff back, and things like that are really important. And there's a really good technique from the High Conflict Institute called BIF, where it's called brief, informative, friendly, and firm. And it's a basic way of just remembering that BIF acronym when you're sending an email back or a response back. So keep it short. Don't do pages and pages. Just be really short with it. Keep it informative. So based on information, you don't need to put all your worldly feelings into the email and all of that kind of stuff. Keep it friendly. So that's remembering the hello, thank yous, and all of that kind of stuff, but be firm. So if you're trying to close down a response, like you don't want to get into a big dialogue over email, don't ask questions, because that opens it up. So think about the use of very closed questions if you're just trying to elicit a very brief response, or the opposite things you do when you're interviewing or talking to people, basically. And don't ask questions if you're just stating something that you are intending to do. And I always say the other one is, don't tell people what you're not going to do. There's nothing more irritating than somebody saying, and I'm not going to be doing this, this, and this. Just don't do it. You don't need to tell somebody you're not going to do it, because that will wind them up. Just don't do it. So it's just the importance of communication is, really becomes very vital. And as I say, trying to find a way of communicating in a constructive way is really important. And there are lots of tools that can help you do that now. We have our own co-parenting app that we launched recently, which has a whole section where you can communicate all about the children. It's all in one place. You can scroll back up and see what you did or didn't agree. And it doesn't get lost in your WhatsApp or anything else. It doesn't interrupt you in the middle of the day. So you get one of those really annoying texts ping in. You can see it's from your ex. You're half reading it whilst doing a Zoom call. It's just horrible, isn't it? It's just really horrible, because when you're at the beginning of it, it makes you feel physically ill when you get those awful messages, and it really affects you, and it affects your well-being. So being a bit more planned about where you're going to communicate and not allowing that to leak into all of your life can be a really good technique to adopt. So, and there are other co-parenting apps on the market, but we obviously think that ours is one of the better ones. So
no, I think that's a great idea, and keeping it out of other communication, so you can go back and look at what you've agreed just completely makes sense to me. This is, I mean, my priority around helping people to want to separate and divorce amicably is around co-parenting, because my parents, who've been divorced for 35 years, still cannot be in the same room together, and it was a horrendous strain on me and my sister. You know, at my kids' christening, at our wedding, it was very, very difficult to have them in the same room, whereas I'm very lucky in that myself and my husband, when we got divorced, we've very carefully tried to do it as amicably as possible, and we knew that we were going to be parenting our kids together for the rest of their lives. It doesn't matter how old they are. To the point that yesterday, it was my son's first rugby, he's 17 now, it's his first match playing for the senior Colts, and we were both there watching him, and he scored a try in front of us both, and it was so important to him that we were both there. And if you aren't able, or if you don't want to do this amicably, at least think about those sorts of things in the future, that you might want to be there for, and you might want to be both able to be there as supporting your child in a friendly way. And if nothing else pushes you to try and be amicable, then
absolutely. The children are the most important thing in all of this, and I think we're becoming more aware of the impact that a bad divorce can have on children. And we're also understanding it's not divorce itself, it's the way that we do it that causes the damage. So we don't have to go down saying that, right, no one should ever get divorced because that's really bad for kids. We've gone past and beyond that. Divorce happens, it's a part of our society, it will continue to happen, and it's more likely that there'll be more relationship breakdowns as marriage declines and we cohabit more, and cohabiting relationships are 5 times more likely to break down than married relationships, but they are becoming way more popular and way more the norm. And therefore, it's likely as a society, we're going to have to get better at moving from relationship to relationship. We're living longer, so that increases the odds even more that you're unlikely to stay with, or less likely to stay with, one partner than you were 10, 20 years ago. So navigating this space is going to become increasingly important, and remembering that if you've been in a relationship where you've had children, then, as you rightly say, that's a lifelong commitment. Your children are going to be there for the rest of your lives, so it's not like you can cut and run. You are always going to be involved with that other person. And I haven't got a good co-parenting relationship still after 10 years of being divorced. So like your parents, it's a great source of upset to me. It's something I would love to change and try to change. We both try, but it's very, very difficult given our circumstances. But it's just, it's when something happens to one of your children, whether it's something that's good or something that's bad, the only other person that gets it is your ex. In quite the same way. And it's love. My parents are fantastic. They've, had a big involvement in my kids' life, but it's still not the same as being able to turn around to your ex and just share that moment. And I can only imagine the shared joy when your son scored the try must have just been heart-stopping. It's just lovely. And you said we are lucky earlier. You're not lucky. You tried really hard to create that scenario. And I think it's that desire to create that scenario, that ability to see that far forward and to think about, there is nobody else in the world that cares for your kids the same way as your ex does. And acknowledging that means sometimes you make compromises that perhaps you wouldn't make in other times of your life. But in order to preserve that ability to be that co-parent, that's what's important.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Children are very, very resilient, but we do have to create the space for them to come through divorce with that resilience and with that emotional stability. Kate, thank you so much for joining me today. Is there anything you want to add before we say goodbye?
I think the only thing that I would want to leave people with is that an amicable divorce is not only possible, but it's becoming increasingly the way people are choosing to do things. So I like people to think of this not as some fringe way of doing it that only a few people do. We help thousands and thousands of people every year. It's becoming way more popular and way more expected that particularly if you have children, that you'll seek and investigate amicable ways of divorcing, whether that's, as I say, through our service or through a mediated approach. But avoiding that traditional battling approach is absolutely vital if we're going to be, a successful society and not damage our kids and get our kids to repeat patterns and mistakes that we've made. So I would just leave people with the idea that this is just normal. It's just not a fringe thing. It's just dead normal to get divorced amicably.
Yeah, and hopefully lots of people will continue to do that. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today.
Thanks for having me, Tamsin.